Ladies and gentlemen, at this time, I'd like to introduce Susan Shaheen from UC Berkeley, the moderator of Social Trends Disrupting Mobility.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back. My name is Susan Shaheen, and I'm with the University of California, Berkeley. We're delighted to welcome you back for an afternoon panel. And make sure you're in the right room. We are focusing on social trends disrupting mobility. So the topic today is all about society and how society is interfacing with technology and what kinds of disruptions we're seeing today. So we're seeing generational differences that are being highlighted by reports similar to Tony's group at Frontier Group that have written extensively about this. We're seeing lifestyle shifts. We're seeing geo-socialization occurring, as well as the utter disruption of social technologies themselves, right? And what role they play in creating trust. So we will examine these differences and challenges in this session today with an emphasis on the role of technology. So what we're going to start with, so I'm just going to give you some ground rules for the session. We're going to start with about 3-minute introductions from each of the panelists. They're going to introduce themselves and the organizations that they represent. I am going to take the moderator privilege of peppering them with a few questions, and then we're going to turn it over to you, and we're going to have as interactive a dialogue and discussion as possible. And I'm going to try to keep these people from fighting each other physically on the stage. I doubt that's going to happen because we have had some discussions before we came up here. So, Zach,
promises were made.
Could you please give us an introduction?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Zach Wasserman. I'm the VP of Strategy at a company called VIA. VIA is an on-demand bus system that lets people request rides in professionally driven vehicles using a smartphone app. We essentially aggregate people going from different origins to different destinations really efficiently in real time. We have no static routes or schedules whatsoever. Everything is continuously updated and optimized to make sure that the system conforms to the actual ebb and flow of demand. We launched in a small corridor of Manhattan in late 2013. Today, we cover all of Manhattan south of 110th Street, and that translates out into tens of thousands of rides every week. At any given moment, we've got roughly 500 vehicles on the road. And we've given about, let's say, just under 2 million rides to date. We're fundamentally different from the other transportation network companies in a few key ways. First of all, we offer a flat fixed fee for travel anywhere within our coverage zone, so there's no time distance formula. People know exactly what they're going to pay before they get into one of our vehicles. We were purpose-built for ride sharing on a massive scale, and so the details show they're reflected in our high vehicle utilization rates. When people ride with VIA, they know that they're going to be matched with other people in a way that is practical and not inconvenient. Because the entire system is based on real-time passenger aggregation, we use larger vehicles, so SUVs and vans. And fourth, lastly, because we use these higher vehicles, we also qualify as a transit pass provider, so people are able to use their pre-tax commuter benefits, which effectively reduces the cost per ride. So what we're actually doing is democratizing on-demand mobility by making rides accessible to people from all different walks of life. Susan, I might also just add, before I pass the mic, metaphorically, is that we're licensing the technology that powers this system to transit agencies as well, and this is part of our vision for the future. We believe that using our kind of virtual infrastructure, agencies can liberate themselves from static routes and schedules and increase their ridership and upgrade the quality of service that they provide.
Thanks so much, Zach. Shomik, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, hi. My name is Shomik, Mehndiratta. Susan actually invited me because I did a PhD at Berkeley.
Yes.
But it's the only reason I'm here. I'm a director of policy at Uber. I have a sense that most of you know what Uber is. But we are part of the world of companies that's trying to replace car ownership. and with ecosystem of options that will hopefully persuade people not to own and drive their own car. I think what's really, I have a sense after this morning that everybody here has a very strong opinion about Uber, and I'm, bring it on. I'm welcome to your opinions, and I would love to answer any questions. But I think what we are and how we think of ourselves is we are doing at scale, as a market player, things that planners have been trying to do and have been failing at for the last half century. So trying to create an aspirational way of weaning people off car ownership, trying to scale carpooling, much like we are doing, at scale, something that for 50 years, all of us as planners, my PhD is in Berkeley from sort of the same world, have been trying to create mobility as a service, as an alternative. And at the same time, I think what we are doing, which is really exciting, is we've become, without trying to become, we've become part of America's safety net. We've become one of the parts of America that helps you understand what is the future of work. 50% of Uber drivers in the US drive less than 10 hours a week. Some of them drive only to earn, to pay for one particular expense. Some of them drive just to pay for the prom dress for their kids. So it's the new America. Use us to understand it. Don't blame us for it. So I'll stop here.
Okay, Paul, what do you got?
All right, well, here I go. So my name is Paul DeLong, and I'm the Car2Go guy here in North America. About 5 years ago, when we talk about kind of disrupting mobility, I would say that we kind of disrupted the car sharing segment within itself. What we are is a one-way or free-floating concept car sharing model, in which you can take a vehicle from point A with instant access, go to destination B. We don't have to come back to the same spot. So 5 years ago, just to be completely honest with you, we had a hell of a lot of doubters out there on our service. A service that takes a lot of operational expense to make sure that it works, kind of like bike sharing. And what I can tell you is that we've learned a lot, but we also really depended on cities to support us. And for me, one of the big things when you're disrupting mobility is being transparent with cities, letting them know, what, we may not have all the answers right now, but give us a shot. Give us a chance to show that a service like ours could work and how we could complement other modes of transportation, such as getting off a train, taking one of our vehicles, going to work, but you don't have to bring that car back to the train station. Next person comes out of that office building, they get into our car and continues to go. So 5 years ago, we were sitting, I remember several conversations, most of which came from my wife. Basically, I've been with Daimler for about 18 years, and most of my career has been on the heavy truck side. So Detroit diesel, 550 horsepower, 46,000-pound rear axles, cement trucks, concrete trucks, you name it, Freightliner, Sterling, you name it. That was my world. And then 5 years ago, I was approached to basically say, hey, we're going to start this thing up. It's called kind of a different way of car sharing, and we need a good storyteller. So after convincing my wife, we were living in Detroit, and if any of you guys are from Detroit in 2008, it was a really bad year because the Lions went 0-16 that year. So let's talk about the OEM perspective. Basically, basically 7 of 10 of my neighbors were on furlough. It was a really bad time in Detroit. The weather also was really brutal, sucked. I mean, there was a lot of snow coming on. And then I told my wife, hey, we're about ready to start something down in Austin, Texas. We don't know if this thing's gonna work. We had 2 young kids. And she's like, you're crazy. I'm like, that's why we're gonna do it. So we are somewhat of a disruptor. It's great that we're having this kind of disruption kind of discussion here in Boston, because we have attempted to bring our service here to Boston, to align ourselves with Zipcar here a little bit, that has their headquarters here, but we'll see what the future brings. But to me, it's about mobility, it's about lifestyle, and probably here in the course of a talk, I have a couple personal stories that I'd love to tell you about in regards to what I think is the biggest problem right now is transportation seems to be an afterthought for a lot of people out there. But until you can tell your personal story in the way that you can communicate it to other people, people start realizing that traffic sucks. And when you start really emphasizing to them how bad traffic sucks and how all these other mobility forms are out there with other ride-sharing services like Uber and Lyft that are out there, that we are truly transforming behavior change right now. And I look at my kids. So that's what I got right now, but I got a lot more to talk about coming up here. So,
Wonderful.
to you.
Turn it over to Erika.
Absolutely. Well, Susan, thanks for having us here. I really appreciate it. You know, we've loved the relationship we've been building with you over the last couple of years, I guess. But I'm excited to be here today to talk to you really about the topic I know the best, which is myself. So my name is Erika Young. I'm the Director of Strategic Partnerships with Transportation for America. We're a program of Smart Growth America. I'm sure you've heard of one of the other organizations, what that means is that we're a national nonprofit, 501c3 advocacy group, so we're not a trade association. So fundamentally what that means for us is that we're going to work with business, civic, elected, and academic audiences on the local and regional level to really push forward what it means not to be a transportation system that has served us in the past, but one that will serve us in the future. We do that, I think we're probably best known for our federal work, which I'm going to talk to you a little bit about later, but we've also been working more on the state level through our recently launched within the last year START network, which is attempting to pass some more progressive ideas on the state level. But then also on the local level, we keep seemingly getting pulled into this conversation of what does it look like? And if Transportation for America addresses topics like how do we fund and finance this program, and what does it mean to get to jobs? And what does it mean to have a number of options that we know people want and need and care about? And what does it mean to be able to value your city's assets in a way that makes you able to have this conversation about private sector actors coming to you? We're getting pulled more and more into that. And of course, you know, we're always happy to have that conversation. But that's who I am. That's who Transportation for America is. And I'm really looking forward to having this conversation on trends with you guys.
Fabulous. Tony.
Sure. Thanks, Susan, and thanks for having us here. My name is Tony Dutzik. I'm a senior policy analyst with Frontier Group. Frontier Group is a nonprofit research and public policy organization, and our mission is to provide information and ideas to help Americans build a cleaner, healthier, fairer, and more democratic society. The story of how I came to be sitting here goes back actually probably about a dozen years when our organization was working with coalitions of groups in the northeastern states who were evaluating policy options for reducing greenhouse gases from transportation. And as part of doing that analytical work, we depended very, very strongly on forecasts of future demand for driving. And after about 4 or 5 years of doing these reports and working with these organizations and looking at this data, we began to recognize something of a pattern, which was that those forecasts of ever-increasing demand for driving weren't accurate. That in fact, there was beginning to be something of a change in driving behavior and travel behavior that was not being factored into decision-making. And so that, along with, I would say, some other streams of evidence that we began to see about changing travel trends among the millennial generation, who, I guess going back to the panel this morning, I'm now supposed to refer to as the snake people. But going back to looking at the trends amongst millennials led us into a line of inquiry that has really been occupying us for the last 4 or 5 years, which is to look at the intersection between social trends, particularly but not exclusively among young people, transportation infrastructure policy, and then now coming back to looking at the implications for all of that and shared use mobility for the connection between transportation and global warming. So I look forward to sharing much more information about the work that we've been doing in the discussion, but that's what brought us here, and really happy to be here.
Wonderful. And Colin, can you give us your perspective?
Yeah, thanks, Susan. My name is Colin Hughes. I'm the Director of National Policy and Project Evaluation at the Institute for Transportation and Development Policy. Kind of wonky titles. ITDP has been around for 30 years, and it's really entirely focused on sustainable transportation. When you look in the sustainable transport field, you don't see a lot of organizations that have been around for 3 decades, because the concept has barely been around of sustainable transportation has really barely been around for 3 decades. ITDP works to encourage sustainable transport in developing countries. So most of my work and the work of my colleagues is in Latin America and Asia and increasingly in Africa. And we really started by a couple of radicals who were largely there to throw rocks at the World Bank, which in their view was really exporting car culture to these developing economies, just building a lot of freeways, giving a lot of loans to kind of the type of transport that wasn't really going to benefit everybody and wasn't really putting the Earth on a sustainable course. And that was before my time, but it's really interesting to see the progress that's happened since then. Now we work very closely with the World Bank and other institutions like it, with national ministries, towards supporting sustainable transport. And I've been with the organization for about 5 or 6 years. One of the first things I did for the organization was running large-scale vehicle fleet models, looking at how the population of vehicles in the world is going to grow in the future. 1990, there were 500 million cars on Earth. 2010, there was about 800 million cars. And for the last couple of years, we've thought there's going to be 2 to 3 billion cars on Earth by 2050. So rapidly increasing vehicle population on Earth as a lot of these developing countries got higher GDPs and higher populations. And really it's just been, and we've been working to get that number lower so that these countries can develop in a way that is less vehicle intensive, more sustainable environmentally, socially, and economically. And really, those numbers were always weighed on me when I started running them as a grad student at Berkeley as well. It looked like such a crushing curve of vehicle growth, and it was hard to imagine convincing all those people to start riding the bus or the metro or their bicycle. And I think really in the last year or two, as we've updated some of those numbers and as I manage staff that's still working on those models, I've actually started to think, wow, these aren't right anymore. You know, we have so many different options that have come online just in the last few years, and there is an alternative now to vehicle ownership. And there's multiple alternatives, and there's a spectrum of them. So I think, you know, I'm working a lot internationally. I know some of these companies are as well. I'm really interested to talk about, you know, the idea of leapfrogging vehicle ownership in the same way that mobile telephone technology leapfrogged, you know, the necessity to build telephone lines everywhere. So, you know, that's one of the things I'm really curious to talk about is in some of these economies in India where vehicle ownership right now, I think something like 8% of the population has a car compared to about 80% in the US. Looking at, you know, how we can change the trajectory of India so that it's not going to have vehicle ownership to the same degree that we have in the U.S. Also, you know, more about social impacts, how these share. Like, I also do a lot of work with bike sharing. We can talk about how that's, you know, affecting and not affecting equity issues in cities, and some of the policy crafting that has to go into making sure that we really harness these technologies in a positive way for, you know, our quality of life in cities.
So let's start the discussion, guys. Ready? So I think a very simple but complex question, right, is why do social trends matter today? You know, what is it about social trends that are making it possible, for instance, for these 3 gentlemen I'm looking at right now to do what they're doing? And how are those social trends different from the past?
So let me say something about that.
Okay.
So I told you guys I'd tell you some personal stories, so here we go. Here's one personal story. And what a fine-looking group this is. I mean, geez, fine-looking group here. So, little response on that. There's one, right?
Warm this up.
So my day starts in the morning. I live probably about 17 miles north of Austin. My day starts at right around 5 o'clock in the morning, and I have to be out of my house by 6:15 in order to make it to my office downtown by 8. When I leave work, I have to leave work probably about if you're safe to make it back up there, and again, this is about 17 miles. I have to leave work, give or take, to be safe. If I would make it, I had to leave about 2:30 in the afternoon to make it up there within a half hour. But if I leave at 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock, it takes me an easy hour, 25, hour 30 to get home. I have 2 kids, and I never see them because I am stuck in traffic. And for me, this is where my passion comes, and I think everyone on this panel, when we talk about social, kind of what this means to us, is that I never see my kids because I'm in traffic. And the worst part about this is when my wife calls me at 4 o'clock, she's like, what time are you gonna be home? And I'm like, I'm gonna be home at 6 o'clock. She calls me at 5:15, I'm still in the office. And she's like, you haven't left yet, have you? And I'm like, no, I haven't left, but I'm on my way. I'm just like grabbing stuff. But I know for a fact I'm not gonna be home until 7:30. Like, I know it for a fact. The quality of my life sucks because I go home and I am in major fights because my wife is stuck with these kids and she hands them to me and says, it's your turn, but it's your turn to put them back to bed. Because I'm missing out on all this stuff. And so when we talk about quality of life and we talk about kind of social, kind of how this is important, to me, I'm not the only one that this is affecting. And the more that my story is heard, and the more that other people can relate to this story, the more that they're gonna start thinking about their own transportation options. Because what we're doing in my family right now is that we're saying, you know what? I'm like, Cindy, I'm sick of fighting with you about this. You know what? Let's move downtown. And yes, it's really expensive moving downtown, but you know what? If we shed this car and we start like moving into a smaller place, I have a dog, I have a big yard. Okay, I gotta pick up poop a lot more because we're having a smaller yard and more often because the kids start running. These are the things for me when it comes to changing. And this is where the passion is, I think, with everyone on this panel is the more that you realize when we say quality of life, people just throw that term around. But when you can really relate to that, and this is part of the storytelling for us on the transportation side, is the more that we can tell people this, the more people in this audience that are doing the really crazy things in this network to help people like me, the better it is for all of us. So for me, when we start looking at this, traffic is a pain in the ass. And I can't stand it because it has affected the way I live my life. And I need to make changes. And the way I'm gonna change is the way that when it comes to transportation, the other forms of transportation, like what you guys all offer here. And I think that the more people that do this, and the more that all you guys, as far as all the research that you guys are doing, the humanity aspect is this other piece that we have to throw in there. Mm-hmm. Because the numbers and the spreadsheets and the PowerPoints, we would never have started Car2Go 5 years ago if we just gave this to an accountant and said, this is what we want to do. It was crazy. But 5 years ago, we did it, and now we're the largest car sharing company in the world. We've done it 5 years ago, but we need to evolve now. And we have to continue to disrupt mobility. And it's people like you guys in this audience that are going to help me do this. And that's my personal story. And I think it's a story that I think everyone on this panel can probably relate to in one way, and all you guys can relate to. And the more that we can tell this story, the more that people are going to adopt and change the way what you're talking about is maybe change the way that they think about transportation.
Tony, I was curious, is this showing up in any of your work?
Well, I think to jump off a little bit from Paul's personal story, I mean, I think when we talk about social trends, we talk about things like technology. We talk about a desire for reurbanization, the desire among many well-educated young people to move back into center cities for a lot of the same reasons. But I think we sometimes lose track of just how dramatically the social landscape has changed for someone coming of age in 2015 as opposed to coming of age, you know, as a Gen Xer or as a baby boomer. You know, you think back to 1970, you know, the average woman got married at 22. She had her first child at 21 and a half, and yeah, I've got the order of those things right. You know, when you graduated if you went to college and graduated, you graduated without student loan debt, largely. I mean, you might have had a little bit, but nothing like what we have today. And if you didn't graduate from college, you had a chance at a decent lifestyle through manufacturing or clerical work in your community. And you could still afford, in a place like Austin, to have a starter home in a relatively new suburb that was a non-crushing commute away from the things that you wanted to do. And now, none of that is true. People are getting married and having children at a later date. Student loan debt is crushing, and if you don't go to college, you have a very difficult time making it in an information economy. Suburban sprawl has long since ceased to be a solution to our affordable housing challenge, especially when you factor in the psychological toll and the financial toll of the commute, and our cities are experiencing a renaissance. So the entire field of decisions and choices that younger people face today compared to what they faced 20 or 30 or 40 years ago is very different. And so it shouldn't really surprise us too much that they are making different choices and that they're experimenting with other ways to go about their daily lives in ways that are different than what previous generations have, and are ways that are indifferent than our policy infrastructure is designed to support. And so, when I hear the speakers here talk this morning about disruption and innovation, to me, obtaining innovation at the scale and speed that it's going to take to really address our social and economic and environmental problems that come from our transportation system is going to require public policy to be of a support as opposed to a hindrance. And we're still, unfortunately, in a place where many of the public policy debates around transportation, especially at the federal level, are the same ones that we could have had 40 years ago.
Right.
Susan, if I could add
absolutely.
To this, I think maybe perfectly adding to what they're saying, that I think there are three trends, and I'll go from the least controversial on. I think the first trend is that I'd like to point out. One is that we have a generation of people aging in suburbia. That has never happened before, right? I mean, the idea of mobility for people aging was just not an issue when people were living in cities. Today it is. Someone in the morning said something about it'll be too dangerous for people to drive. It's not a far-fetched future when someone over a certain age is going to have a much harder time getting a license because there are alternatives. So I think that's the first trend that we're looking at that's kind of big, dramatic. Are they going to age in place as we'd like them to? How are we going to take care of their mobility? Okay. The second trend, and I referred to this earlier, is that the compact between, and this is true in the US, it's true across the world, and even in Europe it's true. The compact between the employer and employee, which was a lifelong compact. Okay, you take care of me, I work for you, and the take care of me included benefits, included everything, the big post-industrial employer. That's gone. It's been going for the last 20 years, but it's gone. Today's worker has to stitch together a career of many, many different careers. They're going to need transition. And if you don't believe me, listen to President Obama's entire platform. All of it for the last 8 years has been about trying to create the institutions that allow people to do that. The Affordable Care Act, a real big focus on community college and adult education. What we are trying to do here is create the institutions that accommodate the societal change. I think that is also a big societal change that has created Uber. That's why we have Uber, because of the mothers who want to work, but only when their kids are either at school or when they've got someone from the family doing daycare. For the people who got fired at 55 and can't get another job, people who are burnt out of one job and just want to take 6 months doing this, or 6 months getting their credit fixed so that they can apply for that government job. Okay, so that's the big societal trend that is allowing this sharing economy to happen. And the third, and I have to say this because someone complained to me at the lunch that there's a chance that everything becomes repetitive, so I have to say something a little provocative. I think what is definitely true about the people who are coming to age now, the millennials, is that their expectations are framed by a technological landscape that is fundamentally different. Okay, so what habits they don't get, what they get used to in terms of the car and the house is totally different. But I think the jury is still out on what their behavior is going to be. I mean, I love the confidence of the people earlier who talked about Sesame Street and cities and the fact that millennials are going to come back to the cities because cities are so cool. I would love it if they do. But I think We'll find out when this growing economy gives them better jobs that lets them afford houses, once they have kids and they want more space, when they have to worry about schools, what they decide to do. Okay, I think what is definitely true is the set of choices in front of them is going to be different. And our business is to try and get them into the cities, because that's when we will make money off them. Because if they go out to the suburbs and buy cars, you know, they're not our market anymore. But the jury is still out.
I'd like to build on your point about how technology helps frame expectations. I think that the theme of this particular panel is social trends and mobility. I would argue that whenever there are, you know, big sweeping tectonic shifts in the fabric of social life, technology and other sorts of trends are sort of interacting with each other, and there are always these sort of feedback loops, and things can be mutually reinforcing. And so if we look at our experience in New York, part of the reason we're able to appeal to riders from, you know, like I said a few minutes ago, all different walks of life. I mean, older people going to doctor's appointments in the middle of the day, younger people going to high school, is because technology has allowed us to make real-time ride sharing convenient. It's made it safe. It's created multiple layers of accountability, so people know who they're interacting with. They know who their drivers are. They know that if they have a problem with another passenger in the vehicle, there is a paper trail or a digital paper trail that they can follow. And it's that sort of, you know, those multiple layers of security that give people peace of mind to experiment with the so-called sharing economy. The sharing economy doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's enabled by multiple different sorts of things.
And you know, this is actually, and I just jump in here, this is actually, to build off, I think, of both of your points. One of the reasons, like my background, I'm not a planner, I'm not an engineer, I'm more of a communicator, former Hill staff, don't hold it against me. But it's more important from where I sit and look at it, because this reality of this new and emerging market hitting up against basically how we pay for it, how we understand it, the local, state, and federal governments who authorize funding, authorize programs and things like that. One of the biggest challenges that I see we're running up against is that you guys have built a fundamentally business-to-consumer model, whereas the public side is still business-to-business. For its entire existence, it's been one government reimbursing another government for building an asset that they assume people use because they study backward-looking trends. But what you're finding, because more people are, it's not anymore, it's not our parents' generation where we have a company telling us what's the truth and we accept it and we move forward with it. Because of things like Twitter, which is fantastic, you know, so much of the customer service functions for companies have moved to Twitter, which I think is great. Sometimes I get a better response than I do by calling a number and talking to a person. But so much of that is people demanding to be part of that conversation. It's no longer one-way conversation. It's no longer me telling you what the truth is and then you kind of just accepting it and moving forward with it. It's me telling you what I think the truth is and you pushing back in very public ways. You know, there are things like Unsuck DC Metro is on Twitter, and that's a way for, living in the DC Metro area, that's a way I sometimes get better service information from them than I do from WMATA. And that's a sad statement, but it's the truth. Same thing with, I think it's NJ Transit Sucks. Same thing. So there are people who are saying, listen, whether or not the government wants to allow me into this conversation, you can either let me in or I'll find a way around you. And that, you know, from Uber's CEO's comments a couple of years ago at the US Conference of Mayors, I was actually, as a former staffer to an elected officials, I was actually really uncomfortable with how confrontational he was, because I'm not used to seeing that. I'm used to seeing people say, okay, well, it's a conversation, we can build on it, it's fine, it's very collaborative. But that he was that confrontational and said, whether you want us here or not, we're here and we're gonna do this. I feel like it was almost a sea change after that article came out, and that people were much more willing to be open and disagreeable with people who formerly perceive themselves to be in a real position of power on the conversation. Just the adoption of technological solutions that have allowed us to do this. You know, my mom, the first time we got a VCR, actually made me sit down and read the instructions before I could touch that VCR. Read the book of instructions. And when was the last time any of our smartphones or gadgets or anything came with instructions? You just kind of had to figure it out by doing. And it's actually funny, my dad is a software tester, so his description is I break things for a living. But so, as you can imagine, technology conversations in our house are fraught with danger. You just kind of run the other way. But it's really, I think, something that is a totally different mindset. And when we look at policymakers, I think a number of us are really just kind of getting there to where we have to have these hard conversations with our bosses who, in my case, have always been easily 30, 40 years older than me. And I recall a former congressman I worked for, I could hear him shouting from his office when someone was trying to set up his email, and he would say, "The internet, is that like the web?" Yes, Congressman, that's exactly like the web. You are correct. He was a very sweet guy. He just, it was a totally different reality. Beyond the technology implications, the emergence of cities, we've talked a lot about it here, but Smart Growth America, our parent group, released a report called Core Values this last year, and I wrote it down. They studied the years between 2010 and 2015, because we kept hearing about how companies were moving back downtown because that's where their market is, right? The density is there. If there's one thing we can take away from, I think, talking with our private sector partners, it's density matters. So what they found was that rather than have anecdotal answers about companies moving back downtown and maybe that's a thing they could do, they actually documented it across the country. And I would definitely encourage you guys to look on Smart Growth America's website for that report, Core Values. They found over 500 companies have moved back downtown, and they profiled 40 of them. Panasonic, which for a number of reasons, including transit access, moved into downtown Newark, said that their goal is to get 3/4 of their population on transit in the next couple of years. In the next 2 years, maybe? I might have that stat wrong. But there really is not just the idea of people moving back downtown, but those companies and those employers following them because they want that talent, they want that attraction. They're really, really hungry for not just the enormous buying power that the millennial community has, but also the buying power that the older American community has who are also moving back downtown. I think there was an article recently, I forget the publication, but it was saying that it's the older populations that are really crowding out some of the housing choices for some of the younger groups because they actually have a lot of disposable money. So it's an interesting, I think, conflict that we're finding. But that's really, I think, from our perspective, two of the big social trends are not to be hackneyed or oversimplistic or repetitive, but really just that way technology is changing our fundamental communication with one another and the expectations we have for that, and how that then feeds back into the success of companies like yours, but then also how it's going to ultimately change what happens in the public space, and how do public officials then get concerned and protect some of their roles as leaders of their community.
I think like talking about the value, you're talking about public space and values. I was just thinking along similar lines. It's interesting how this disruptive mobility has changed public I think it's almost like enabled a rethinking of the value of public space and of a lot of public assets. You see things like Haystack, which
I was going to mention Haystack.
Found a way to, parking is vastly undervalued all over this country, all over a lot of countries, and the public sector wasn't stepping in. I think there's a lot that can be done to privatize parking meters and things like that, and ensure that there's something closer to a market price being paid. And the public sector wasn't doing that, and a really smart company found, I think, a pretty sketchy way to get in there and extract revenue from that.
Can I interrupt you for one second? So I think for Haystack, because I really love that argument, I think it underpins a lot of what I just talked about. It takes what everyone has traditionally viewed as a public good and turns it into a private service when no one was asked or consulted. So that is such a perfect example of how does a city, and I know when Haystack tried to come to Boston, y'all were out with like pitchforks in the street, we're on fire. But, I just think it's such a great example, and it really underpins a lot of the conversation that's going on is, are you taking that control out of my hands? And I did not say that public good could be a private service, and you haven't asked me. So I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but I just think it's a beautiful example. I'm so glad you brought it up.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly it, is now when people see it monetized like that, when people see that the service is taken out of their hands and that they haven't been in a position to weigh in on that or to talk about it, I think then the public role of both valuing and being the marketplace for that good, and also as the public role of convening a forum to talk about how that good is allocated, all of a sudden people are talking about that. For years, my organization has been pushing for parking policy as the least sexiest thing.
Oh,
Nobody
yeah.
wanted to do it. But then you have, some of these services come in and they have really smart ways of valuing these things. I mean, Get Around helped all of us figure out the value of having a car sit empty in our driveway in the same way Airbnb helped us figure out how much that extra bedroom, is worth in our homes. And one thing I love about Uber is I actually think Uber is training the American public for congestion pricing. With their peak pair, their surge pricing, Americans are finally forced to realize that, wow, if I want to go out at peak hour, that there's a limited supply of mobility for me at any time, and at peak hour, I'm going to have to pay more to get that. I think, that's essentially like a starter course in congestion pricing.
As I said, it's companies doing what planners have wanted to do for 50 years and failed. Yeah?
So peak fare, absolutely. Peak of the peak that WMATA tried did not go so well. For those of you not familiar with the DC Metro system, they revamped the prices for transit to be, not peak, and then they had like this really tight window that was peak of the peak. So really it was a 3-tiered pricing system based on distance and things like that. So my question would be, if someone were to do research on this topic, not that I'm looking at any of our academic friends in the audience, but what's the difference between how Uber is preparing people and how WMATA has not
Can I answer that? And I think this takes us a little bit from societal trends to almost the future and how people should respond to it. And I think this is a typical case in which, I think it's time, all this change is a time for government, and I use kind of the generic word for government without putting blame on anyone. Being at the World Bank for 10 years, I've worked with governments, I've done it most of my career, so I'm very sympathetic with it. But it's to take a step back when we talk about regulation, to look at public interest in a very focused, in a very disciplined manner, okay? And then figure out a framework where we're looking at outcomes, okay? Because in public transport at the moment, in particular, we have this situation that if I was to describe to you without giving you context would sound absurd. Because what you're doing is you have a service that for various political reasons, half the country decided is no good. The other half decided, is protected in the cities as social justice. So you have some lines of this entire country's public transport system which actually play a hugely important role in making those metropolitan areas function. But most of it is there as social justice, which means that it's not competitive enough for anybody who has the income to actually use it, okay? So it's basically for people who can't use it. You've created a situation where public sector unions, instead of kind of having a tension conversation about what it means for costs, you subsidize them. Your fares pay 30% of the operating costs. So you've got a system where you're subsidizing the system to provide service mostly to people who don't have any choices. Of course, in that context, any attempt to raise the prices runs up against the problem that most of the population that you're trying to serve is a population that has limited means and limited choices. If we were to go one step back and take the two different things we're trying to do here, the social justice and what we're trying to do with providing public transport, mass transport, take the money, take all the subsidy out of the system, okay? Create the tension between the workers and the ride payers. You have, when fares go up in many cities in the world, people are out protesting. That's a healthy tension between the workers who are working in the system and the workers outside. It's a good tension to have. And let the money, charge full fare, and take the money for the people who need it and give it to them through direct subsidies, earned income tax credits, or however you want to do it, pre-tax credits, however you want to do it. Okay? And then see how the system shakes out. See how both those two different goals of mass transport and social justice play out. I would suspect that what would happen, and I say it because this is what I've thought about, that 40% of the least competitive and least profitable parts of the public transport system will be replaced by ride sharing. And all the money that public transport gets will be invested in the core lines, the big, high capacity lines that you can't have cities without. And I think that would be a good thing.
Mm-hmm. Well, this leads me to, I think, one of the biggest questions is, now we're seeing private forces. We've got 3 major private forces here on the stage with us, right? You guys are each doing different models of mobility. How do we integrate your services into our transportation ecosystem in a way that we get the maximum win for everybody? Nobody gets left behind, and we reduce GHG emissions, and we get this done right. I mean, I think that's one of the key questions of this entire summit is, what is the role of government now? What's the role of the private sector? And how do we make the consumer part of this entire discussion and dialogue?
Well, you're about ready to see it, right? I mean, and it's coming fast in autonomous driving, in which government and the private sector, I mean, we have to work together. And even on my car sharing segment of my piece, of my side of mobility, these are conversations that are happening now, but testing is going on right now. And sooner or later, people like us, we're going to be merging eventually as well. Like, we're going to be competing against each other eventually pretty quickly. But the thing is there are so many legal issues that are out there right now, and old law that's out there right now that is prohibiting future innovation that, like you talked about, social justice is, what is the public good? And autonomous driving could be a big piece of this, in which when we talk about just infrastructure with autonomous driving, in which you can get dropped off, a car goes and parks, but then you don't have this gap in between because you have to open up a door. So there's a lot of things that can start happening with autonomous driving, but we need that support from the local government, from the feds, from everyone else, to work together to figure out what is this best solution for urban mobility.
Yeah, and I'm so curious about what Colin has to say.
And he's probably got a lot to say about this.
I asked Colin to be here with me on this stage because he's representing not a car.
Okay, so I mean, it's interesting to talk about mobility as a good, and what I always come back to is that mobility it's an intermediate good. Mobility is not a final good. Nobody consumes mobility for the sake of mobility. The final good is always access to a destination, right? And so I think what our conversation comes back to in terms of crafting the policy is really, and I was the guy fist pumping in the back when somebody yelled out, we need to disrupt land use planning, because I think that's where really we have to start the discussion, is what kind of community do we want to live in? Mm-hmm. How do we want to shape it? What kind of lifestyles do we want? What are the outcomes in terms of air quality and child asthma and things like that, all of which the externalities of mobility affect. But we need to start with the kind of community we want. And I think for the last 2 decades in this country, there's been an increasing amount of people who have a different vision than the green grass suburb white picket fence idea, and they've wanted a new type of community, and I think now we're getting mobility solutions that do further enable it. But the public policy conversation has to be about how do we harness them to achieve this goal. And as Shomik and I were talking about before we came on stage, that's a difficult conversation in this country where it's very heterogeneous and there are a lot of different values and ideas. But I think that's the real. Everything we're doing here has to be at the service of achieving this vision of a community and a city, because that's the final good. And so first we start with that, and then we say, how can we use all these amazing advancements to get there? Right.
I think an alternative vision to sort of the de facto privatization of some big part of public transit, which is what would happen if the transportation network companies, I think, sort of eroded too much of public transit's ridership, would be to encourage transit agencies to actually begin to take advantage of new kinds of technology, to use virtual infrastructure. So transit agencies have used digital technology sort of in peripheral ways. So for example, computer-assisted dispatch is a way to make routing a little bit more efficient, or automatic vehicle location allows people to track their bus or the subway using a smartphone. There's mobile ticketing, there's e-ticketing, and all those things are great as far as they go, but I think the real disruption of mobility will happen when transit embraces new kinds of technology to remodel the way it delivers service. So just to provide a little historical context, in the 19th and 20th centuries, if you wanted to achieve economies of scale in transit, you created a rigid system with fixed nodes, and then you loaded people into high-capacity vehicles at regular intervals, and that's how you brought down the trip cost. Today, we have technology that would allow us to achieve similar economies of scale for certain kinds of use cases, not for all use cases, but for certain kinds of use cases, by bringing vehicles directly to passengers and aggregating them in a very efficient way, but without having to make huge fixed investments in physical systems that are difficult to modify, that don't evolve as demand patterns change, and demand patterns, of course, are always changing. And I think that if transit wants to sort of amplify its relevance and make itself more fiscally sustainable, at least having a conversation about these new kinds of technologies is going to be important.
Can I just disagree with you on one thing, though, when you talk about privatization of public transport? Those of us who went to planning school, we learned very much that the heyday, the best days of American public transport were when it was private. The problem with American public transport became when they started losing money and they had to become publicly run. I mean, let's face it, the US public transport system is kind of more Soviet than anywhere else in the world. I mean, can you imagine in Europe today to have public transport systems that are all run in London, to have a public transport system that is all run by public governmental entities? In India, in Latin America, it is only an American phenomenon that comes out of the bankruptcy of public transport. Let's face it, I mean, government is great for some things, but it shouldn't be in the business of operating systems. It should be in the system, in terms of, and that's exactly what I'm talking about. Government should be in the business of framing the outcomes, not in terms of tying themselves to.
Terribly controversial.
Of course.
And I would take issue with it.
You go first, and I have a question that I want you to answer.
In the timeline of that, when our for-profit private public transportation systems were going down was precisely at the moment when we were destroying our cities. We were knocking down large chunks of our cities for urban renewal. We were plowing freeways through them, and essentially we were eroding the very land uses that enabled those systems to be sustained to begin with. And I think to bring it back to the conversation about the role of government, the one place where government will indisputably have a role going forward is in how our very valuable public space, which is street space, is allocated among various users of the system. And that's another place where we made a set of very conscious decisions early in the 20th century about prioritizing motor vehicles over pedestrians and other uses of those spaces that has helped lead us to where we are today. And I think as we think forward to autonomous vehicles, there was discussion this morning, I think Gabe Klein had said, with autonomous vehicles that we can have HOV 3 lanes every third street, and we can take out parking, and we can, perhaps have more pedestrian spaces. We can actually do all of those things now. We don't have to necessarily wait for vehicle automation to make the kinds of changes in our urban fabric that will deliver some of the values and benefits that we expect to come with automation. So, I think one of the challenges would be, for those of us who are imagining what a future of autonomous vehicles might look like, to think about what parts of that vision can we actually implement right now in our communities without autonomy that will deliver many of the same benefits, and then we'll be ready when they come.
Right. So in Shomik, I was not trying to shut you down, but I think what you're raising is perhaps one of the most challenging ishes we are all going to face, right? Is what do we do about this
I think you have to have the dialogue. And now I'll switch to something that you were saying, that you want to make housing more affordable in the cities?
Yeah.
Let's face it, it's a simple thing we can do right now, and government's in the way. It's parking minimums. Sure. Why can you not have it? It's not that the market wants to build only luxury houses. It's if you have to bake in the parking minimums, you cannot provide middle-class housing in the cities. So how do we try and create, again, a system where government looks at the outcomes, looks at the public interests, and doesn't go in incrementally with a lot of rules.
But then we also have to look at then, transit competes with private transport in the U.S.,
Right.
which is also, the debate about subsidies for New York City bike share. I'm supposed to be the bike share guy on the panel as well. It's mind-boggling to me.
You said it once.
I do. I have some notes about it. But I mean, it's mind-boggling to me because people are saying we shouldn't have a public subsidy for these hipster bike things that are now clogging up our corners and everything. But really, like automobiles are subsidized from their manufacture in this country to the sourcing of the fuel.
Stop subsidizing.
Their parking. We know that the Highway Trust Fund certainly isn't building all those bridges and roads anymore. Hasn't been for a while. In a lot of states, it's gasoline taxes are paying less than 50% of the infrastructure construction for roads. So we've got that it's and I'm agreeing with you in the sense that the government is distorting again what the real costs are, and that's to say nothing of automobiles not paying for the cost of all their negative externalities, like all that, child asthma or greenhouse, climate change, things like that. But I mean, this is what we have to look at as well. Is the subsidies are really rigging this game, and I think they need a lot. I think we have to look at those. I think the effectiveness of some of these modes for certain types of trips is highlighting that. And getting back to the bike share in New York, I mean, here we have people arguing against bike sharing in New York is the only mode that is unsubsidized. And it's also the only mode that has really almost no negative externalities on the city. Yet it's the one mode that's completely unsupported. So, there is a lot of distortion here. We have to start really investigating it, I think.
So I'd like to turn over the panel to the audience, if any of you have any questions. Does anybody have anything they'd like to raise? Okay, great. I see someone right here, and then over there. We're just getting the mics out to you guys right now. If you could introduce yourself and your organization, that'd be great. Take it easy on them, please.
Bring it.
Will I go?
Yes, please.
Hi, William Fitzgerald. I do PR and policy for Google/Sidewalk. So this morning, Mr. Negroponte asked us to look at Europe and how the transport systems work so well, and it's not, most of them are actually run by governments. And I just moved from Asia, where most of the transport networks are actually run by governments, a lot of public-private kind of operations. And the gentleman here from Uber has just kind of made a to me quite an outlandish statement about the best. And I didn't go to city planning school, so I'm not sure if this is accurate, but the best transport was when it was run by private. I don't know which is right or wrong, and I was interested what is right? Like, do we think that the better transportation system for all would be kind of something that government have control? Because my basic understanding on how public versus private works is that private companies typically operate at the behest of their shareholders, but government are trying to operate to serve everybody, so that those that can't afford private services. So around the room, I'm interested to show of hands. Do we think that the transportation would be better served by a pure private play or a government play?
Can I just explain that it's not a pure private play that we're talking about, that if you go around Europe and understand how the public transport systems are run, government has a role in designing the level of service, the routing, and then they procure service from private players. And that's actually how it's done more and more in Latin America too, the Transmilenio system, which is perhaps one of the most successful new bus-based systems. Is built exactly the same way. Government decides, government invests in the infrastructure, but the service is run by publicly procured private operators. And how do you handle the role of the poor? Well, I was at the World Bank at the time, and we helped structure this, that the people who are means tested get a subsidy, a rider-side subsidy, which is paid for by government. So what you try to do is, in any structure, is you take the role of government, and that's what I said. Government has a role, but it should be on outcomes. It shouldn't be on a step-by-step. Because when government focuses on outcomes, which in this case is level of service, and it does the routing, and if there's big, massive infrastructure, it takes care of that infrastructure. There's roles in all of those places. That's a little different from a completely private system. And that's a different discussion, which we should have a different day. Yeah.
So you wanted the audience to raise their hands for privatized and then blended. Please.
It was just a specific quote about this thing that in planning school we learned that that stuff that was private was better, and that how U.S. transport
and
worked
again,
better.
just for that, the context here is that all the big subways, the Boston subway, the New York subway, all of them were created by developers, and they were run by developers until the 30s, 40s, 50s. And at a time when those were like the superior goods, you had people, and now I'm really getting into public transport history, they were using public transport not only on weekdays, but on weekends. Mm-hmm. And once they stopped doing that, the public transport systems lost their luster, went from being superior goods to inferior goods. Those developers stopped wanting to handle them. They went bankrupt, and that's when the public sector took them up. So that's just the history of public transport. That's not, there's no
That's like saying like the entire result is based on one individual factor, which I feel like is maybe not entirely accurate. To say like when the developer stopped funding them, the public transportation system declined.
It's not the developer stopped funding them. When the alternatives came, the cars came,
right,
and people stopped using them on weekends. They stopped becoming profitable.
Right.
The developers found that they were not making money as entities, and they were ready to let them down. And that's when the public sector came in.
But again,
I was not trying to be controversial there. I was just trying to give you the facts.
Data point. I hear where you're coming from.
Yeah.
But the point in time that we're at is controversial, though, right? Is we're seeing these new services, all of you represent new services, that perhaps threaten the role of public transportation. This is something in our research we're constantly asked to look at. Is this complementing? Is this competing? Why is that happening? When is that happening?
Never will we ever compete with the subway in Manhattan. Just what it does, or the Red Line, or what that does in terms of moving hundreds of thousands of people super efficiently. That is what we will always be trying to complement. And I think that's but I've done a lot of work for public transport agencies, and there are parts of that network that cost $60 a ride, okay? And that part, which is a transit feeder going through the outskirts of Bethesda, hey, public money would be much better spent giving $9 vouchers for a ride-sharing company. So you can take the rest of that money and invest it in the metros. So, I think, again,
we have to evolve it. I think that's what you're saying, Shomik.
I'm talking about something that will happen.
Evolving.
That could happen. Mm-hmm. But this is not an anti-public transport argument. This is a pro-public transport argument.
I think we've become so used to in our public policy debates in the United States, at least, and I don't know, I'm an American and I focus here, so I don't know the extent to which this is true elsewhere, but we've become so used to seeing the debate as a binary between investment in highways and investment in transit. And then over here, there's a bunch of there's some biking, there's some walking, there's taxis, there's a whole bunch of little things over here that are too small for us to really worry about. And I think now what we're seeing with both emerging trends and also emerging technologies is that landscape becomes infinitely more complex, and there become many more varieties of service that range from, and will range from, publicly funded, publicly directed, and publicly run, all the way to completely private, with every variation in between. And so where policymakers and the public need to come in is to begin to sort out, and I agree with Shomik to the degree that establishing outcomes, establishing targets, and setting a very clear strategic direction, which we don't have, we generally, even at the urban level and certainly at the federal level, we don't have a clear sense of what we want our transportation system to do. Are we going to organize it and optimize it around climate change and energy conservation? Are we going to optimize it around safety? Are we going to optimize it around the ability of every suburban commuter to get everywhere that they need to go at a moment's notice with no congestion? All of those, and they're real decisions, and they're decisions that we haven't, in part because we've been locked into some of these old debates that we haven't been able to have in their fullness. And that's where I think we need to be starting to move some of these discussions is toward these bigger picture questions of what is it that we're trying to achieve?
I would say if you're a private sector company that actually has to put together a business plan that's revenue positive in 5 years, don't look to the federal government. They're in the middle of, and as a person who works for an organization that is desperately trying to make it better, we're in the middle of that fight right now, and we just passed a House bill out of the House of Representatives that when T4 tried to get amendments passed that would have increased the amount of funding and authority for local governments, we were told that that's not in the federal interest. When we worked with other groups to try and simply expand to definitions of what's eligible, we were told that's not in the federal interest. So the guys you have, the men and women you have in Congress right now, they're just not going to be there and be the forward-looking ones. So really the energy and the activity has to happen like city to city. And that's actually one of the reasons that T4 is not moving away from the feds, because we think they still have an amazing ability to mess things up. So we're going to try and contain that. But they're just not going to give us the leadership we need. So we're going to go to some extent to the states, but really to the local, again, business, civic, elected, academic audiences and say, what can you guys put together? Because there's a joke in DC that no law passed on the federal level was ever brand new. It was always really well vetted by the time it got there. Mm-hmm. So, you see that from like welfare reform in the 90s and other examples as well, but the feds aren't gonna help you. But I will say this administration, I feel like this is probably the best urbanist president we've had possibly since Johnson. Mm-hmm. He's at least tried to put stuff out there. Whether or not it succeeded, he keeps flinging it against the wall and hoping something will stick. And there are two opportunities, and I'm going to take a second just to give a little bit of a plug, two opportunities that T4 actually really needs your help with right now. There's one that we just put out on Twitter today. It was like a call to action about the rulemaking process that's open currently to reduce the number, or to simplify the design standards on urban streets so that you don't have to design your downtown street for 50-mile-an-hour traffic. We would love it if you guys, @T4 America is the Twitter handle. We'd love it if you guys clicked on it and sent, if you live here in the States, by the way, if you sent a note to submitted some comments through that link to help us gain supporters for that. We opened it, I think, an hour or two ago, and there's already, I think our communication guy told me, we already have a couple of hundred people who've kind of sent those comments in, so we'd encourage all of you to do that. And then also the federal government is in the process of creating a rulemaking that's going to govern how we view and manage congestion and how we understand congestion. And that's based in federal law. They have to do it. So we're in the process of trying to make sure that, God love USDOT, bless their little hearts. They are in the process of writing that rule, and we are trying to help them understand a way to write it that actually encourages things like density and allows cities to be more authoritative in what they're trying to do, as opposed to the alternative, which would be basically to say, if we widen a road, then we'll reduce congestion. But, I live in DC.
So they've heard Paul.
They heard, oh, absolutely, absolutely.
They heard you and they responded really before you even vocalized it.
Mm-hmm. And I live in DC, and there's no way you're taking out another lane of traffic down Connecticut Avenue to try and widen that road. That's one, just not feasible, and two, why would the city give up that kind of tax revenue? Got it. It doesn't make any sense at all.
So shall we do another question, guys?
I'd actually like to quickly pick up on a previous thread. In addition, or let's say in lieu of subsidizing transportation network companies to have them do what public transit agencies aren't currently doing well, you could also give those transit agencies the tools to improve what they're doing. Right. So there would be ways to upgrade paratransit and make it work better for the people who use it while making it more cost effective to deliver. There would be ways to take buses off of trunk lines during off-peak hours when they're being underutilized and use smaller vehicles on a demand responsive basis that are less expensive. There would be ways to create first and last mile connector services to increase total ridership on light rail lines and metro lines and bus rapid transit. And I think that for this to start happening, I feel like there needs to be some leadership at the top, probably meaning it has to come from Washington, I think. And that could be from the White House, the Department of Transportation, the Federal Transit Administration. I think that these stakeholders can use their convening power to put technology companies, specifically technology transportation companies, and public sector stakeholders together in the same room to have more constructive conversations and sort of dispel the myths that I think both sides have about each other. I think that there are also opportunities to streamline and reform the public procurement process, make it more transparent, shorten the feedback loops, make it work better for taxpayers. And finally, I think that there are opportunities to create new kinds of funding mechanisms, essentially, to give agencies the resources that they need to experiment with new kinds of technologies, judiciously, of course, because agencies are always going to have to balance different kinds of considerations. Safety is always paramount. But let them experiment, let them see how things work, and for those things that work well, there should also be funding available to support those new sorts of services on an ongoing basis after they've been properly vetted.
So proactively engaging the private sector.
I think so. There's a lot of scope for that.
Okay, we had a question. I'm going to come back to you.
Chris with International Transport Forum in Paris. I'd like to go back to Shomik's statement and give Shomik a little bit of love because I think he deserves it for that statement. And then maybe take a little bit back. What Shomik has said, I'm a bit bewildered around this discussion on public transit and the provision of public transit, because if we're talking about disrupting mobility outside of the United States, what Shomik has said is completely uncontroversial. In fact, what he described was the model whereby public transport services are delivered in most of our member countries, in most places around the world. And in more and more places around the world. The government's framework setting up level of service requirements, outcome-based requirements, and then letting the private sector bid on concessions for that. And where I'm going to take a little love back from Shomik is what would be the reason that TNCs or other mobility disruptors should be exempt from that, or should they be? When you have a concessioning rule for a city to provide public transport services, quasi-public transport services, should TNCs also be under that concessioning framework? Should there be certain types of requirements for the provision of services throughout the city or proof of provisions of that service? And so the question I have specifically on that is, are we getting to a space where the regulatory requirements that we put in place can be alleviated by having an information feedback from those that are delivering services in our cities on the outcomes of their services, in the case of congestion, in the case of equitable access. Having a data feedback to the cities that would allow you to operate, you or any other public transport agency. And if you meet these service requirements, then okay, you are able to operate.
I mean, I love your question. I think it's a great question. So I think, there are 2 or 3 elements to that, right? One is the element that, and it's easy for me to put on the hat that you're wearing, because as you know, I've spent most of my time wearing that hat, is that the city is financing public infrastructure, the road network, and other elements of the infrastructure, And how does the city get some, I don't know if the word is return, but there's some responsibility related to that. And I think that's a very different way of, and today actually you do, because a lot of cities impose different kinds of fees, taxes, and that's really conceptually how they get their return for that investment. That's the compact between the city and any commercial service. Right? Or any kind of service. I come out and I sell books, but I say pay a sales tax or a VAT or whatever it is. I'm not a tax expert. And it's the same. When we use your streets, we pay all the range of taxes related to economic activity. Now, if you want to include congestion in that, okay, which is what I heard you say, I would say take a step back, because let's face it, 2% at most, in a city like New York, 2.5% of the cars on the street are TNC vehicles. Let's not forget that this is a debate that we should have been having, as Colin said, for the last 30, 40 years about how cars are treated in general. And if you want to create a debate about how cars are treated, then let's talk about that. And let's have that discussion. And we can be stakeholders in that discussion. But in that discussion, we're a minority. And remember that, that everyone talks about the fact that the differences between your personal cost of congestion and the marginal cost that you're imposing. Hey, when we have thousands of cars in there, we are actually facing that cost. So we have to internalize those costs. So we are the kind of we are the ideal stakeholder to have that discussion. Just be fair about it.
What about the data? I think another important aspect of Philip's question was data exchange in cities. And I think that's definitely one thing that cities could use to more effectively plan around congestion and
what kind of data?
And aspects like that.
What kind of data, Colin?
Speed of travel during congestion, like pickups, origins and destinations. There is a rich data set out there that could be used for planning.
I think within the company, we are still trying to understand both what the uses of the data would be and how to deal with the range of issues. And let me be clear about some of the issues. There are privacy issues. I mean, Uber is still a young company. And not that long ago, when we were even younger, we got into kind of severe trouble because of mismanagement of personal data. So that's a very big priority. And when you're talking about a company like ours, which is e-hail, it's not like pickup points of taxis in New York, which are anonymized because you don't know who picked them up. If our data becomes public, there are all kinds of privacy concerns that are kind of scary.
And I wouldn't put it just on, even telecom companies. It'd be great if we could start getting data sets on anonymized data sets.
But it's even
where
with
people were moving,
even with
especially
them,
in developed countries. This is a huge issue.
So the privacy is a big concern. A second big concern, and let's be frank about it, is that in this new world where all of these data are being generated, and none of us really know exactly, because our OD data at the moment, let's face it, is not very useful. First, because it's changing so fast. Week to week, it's changing, and then it's reflective of a small. I've looked at it.
It's at the zip code level. What are we going to do with that?
Even if you had it at the exact. I've been trying to figure out for the last few months how to use that data in a planning context. But in a situation of the fluidity we have, where we are growing so fast, week to week, month to month, that OD data is changing because we are growing. And it's still not very representative of anything. I was trying to figure out how you could anchor it to the 10-year ODs. It's not you. I don't know what you're going to do with it. Okay. Yeah.
Yes. Is that Tim?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
We would love to know origin and destination data, utilization data, average trip length data. Do you know why? Because we need to know where people are going in terms of impacting the transport system. That would be huge for us to know. I don't need to know that it's Jane, Cliff, or Bob Jones or whatever. I don't care who they are. I don't care their backgrounds. But I'd love to know, are there 16,000 people going at the intersection of X and X, or is it 60,000? Because that makes a huge difference on how we manage our transportation system. Let's call a spade, please.
So I think this is exactly where we are trying to figure out, first, the protections, there's the value, there's always the prospect of commercial value, which no one really fully understands. There are companies like InRix and TomTom, which this is what they do. And I don't see anyone asking them to reveal their data. Everyone accepts that, hey, these guys in Google, that they make their money through this, so they should be allowed to make their money through this. They get their data from the same sources. Okay?
Yeah.
Sorry?
We're asking them.
Yeah. Well, so let's understand that. And I think, and I don't mean to be controversial saying this.
Sure you do.
That we have to be very careful that we understand and the regulatory framework that we are going into. Because I know that a lot of you believe that Uber has been too aggressive in asking for what it has asked for. But from Uber's perspective, we see ourselves getting blindsided almost by regulatory desires that seem more to do with Uber than to do with the public interest. And I think we'll have to feel a little more comfortable about the regulatory framework and to be forthcoming about data. I mean, let's face that.
Okay, Tilly's been looking at me, so.
I almost feel like this should be, the next panel should be public and private rules, because all of these issues come back.
Can somebody get Tilly a mic, please?
The public versus the private law. I really appreciate it. Just to add to Tim's comment, I think
Tilly, wait.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. One of the
Tilly, tell us who you are.
Hi, I'm Tilly Chang from San Francisco County Transportation Authority, a colleague of Tim's at the SFMTA. Appreciate the rich conversation, and I appreciate, Shomik, you going there and laying it out there, because these are the honest, candid conversations we need to have at the city, local government, state level, because feds, you're right, Erika, it's just not going to happen there. And so if we really want to tackle these issues, we have to have honest conversations like this. And I think one of the practical things that we need to understand from an on-the-ground standpoint is, where should we be making room at the curb? I mean, the public right-of-way is our precious asset. It's the street space, it's the curb space. Yes, we've had public policy failure, essentially, to regulate that curb. You make strong points, but at the same time, on the street now, there are safety conflicts. There are bike lane violations, there are bus lane violations, and it's not that the TNCs and everybody else, private shuttles, employers, nonprofit shuttles, they all want to know what to do. So in order for us as government to be able to set the right policy and provide the right infrastructure, we need to know what the demand is. We need to be in constant collaboration and conversation. We've actually addressed this before. We were confronted with a similar opportunity and challenge with the employer shuttles, so-called Google shuttles. It wasn't just Google. In fact, the big 6 regional operators were just a minority of, if you take it as a whole, of all the different operators in the city. So I think that we've been here before. We can do it again, but it does take an honest conversation and dialogue and collaboration.
Well, thank you so much for that final remark, Tilly. It ends us, I think, on a really good note. And really what we wanted to have before you today was an honest conversation. And we really wanted to talk amongst ourselves and allow you in on that conversation. And I really want to thank each and every one of the panelists for your perspectives and encourage all of you to continue this dialogue, because that's exactly why we're here today. Is we want to take this out of what is Shared Mobility 101 to a much different level of how are we going to sort through all of this. So with that, I want to thank each and every one of you for making your way to Cambridge and to joining us for this really important event. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan.